Hi everyone, my name is Mark Moikins from Big Mountain Studio. If you're interested in iOS development, then subscribe right now and click on that bell icon so you can get notified when I come out with new iOS tutorials. Now in this video, we're going to work on deleting activities with a table row swipe. And deleting activities should be pretty fast because we've already covered the swipe actions before. We'll also update our activity model to include a delete function so we can delete an activity. Okay, so here are the actions we're going to take in this video. We're going to update the model to include a delete function. We're going to create a table trailing swipe action so we can delete that activity. Then we'll call our new delete function in our model. And then we're going to remove that activity from the local data variable so we don't have to reload the whole table to get rid of that row. Okay, we'll jump into our project and get started by adding that delete function to our activity model. Once we have that, then we'll move on to the swipe action. But before we get into that, let's take a look at our task board. Now, the next task I had was to edit and delete activities. I thought this would be pretty easy and that we could do it in one video, but as I started working on it, I found it was actually pretty complicated. There's a lot of steps that are involved, especially with editing activities, because you can edit an activity and move an activity to a different day, and that involved a lot of different steps. And then when I was working on editing activities, I found that when you moved it to a different day, it would just append it to the bottom, the end of the day. And a user might want to move an activity to the middle of the day or the start of the day. So we're going to need another video so I can teach you how to do reordering. So what we're going to do is we're going to take this task here and we're going to break it up into 3 separate tasks. So let's add another card. There we go. Okay, so we're just going to edit this one. And this will be deleting activities. There we go. Okay, let's jump into our project and get started. All right, one of the last things that we did is we added this animation. So I want to show you a quick refactoring before we get started with deleting activities. Let's just run the project and see what it looks like. Okay, it loads up, we see the icon, and then there's going to be an animation. Okay, and you notice the animation, part of it happened behind some of those cells. And I got a suggestion from one of my patrons that said, how about we just show the animation, and then when the animation finishes, we load the trips, the rows. And I thought that was a good idea. So that's what we're going to do. And as it happens right now, we load the trips, and then we start our animation right here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this section of code right here that loads our trips, and I'm going to refactor that into its own function by extracting a method. We'll call it getTripData. Okay. And when you refactor functions, it puts it above, but I don't like it in this location. So I'm going to take it out and I'm going to move it below the viewDidLoad. Okay. Now, as you may know, a lot of UI animate functions have a completion handler, and we didn't have anything we wanted to do when the animation was complete. So it's not in here right now, but we can easily add one with just a closure like that. And then has a variable that's passed in that tells us if it's successful or not. And then in here, we can call that function that getTripData. There we go. Okay, let's see how that looks. Oh, I forgot to do. I forgot to delete this call right here. So that's why we didn't really see any change. All right, let's try it now. Yeah, that looks a lot better. Okay, now at this point, what I want to do is that's kind of like a separate piece of functionality or refactoring that I did. It's separate from deleting activities. So what I wanted to do is commit this as a separate commit so I don't mix different tasks with my commits. So let's just go up here. We'll just go to source control and commit it. There we go. Okay, now our next task is to update our activities model so it has a delete function, because right now there's no delete function. Okay, so we want a delete function. And what I'm going to do, I'm going to copy this function because a lot of the parameters are the same. And then we'll just call this delete. Because when we delete an activity, we have to know what trip it's in. And then we also have to know what day that activity falls under. And then we'll need this activity model because remember, activities is in an array. And when we want to remove something from an array, we have to know what index it's at. So I'm going to use that activity model to find the index, find out, is it in position 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then delete it from the array. Okay, and we kind of have like a long chain here. We have to go into our trips, get the right trip, go into our days, get the right days, and then we go into the activity models. So I think what I'm going to do is I'm just going to extract this into its own variable. So let me copy that. There. Now we can just access the day, and then from the day, we can access the activity models. Okay, so what's the first thing we want to do? Well, first we have to find out where this activity model is, what the index is under the day models, activity models. Because remember, if we look at the day model, see it has this activity models. So we have to go in here, find the activity, get the index, and then remove it. So let's get rid of this. We don't really need that. And I think we've gone over this before. We talked about this function called the first index of. So we're going to use that. We'll just access our new day model variable there. And from here, I want to say first index. And I don't want to use first index where. I want to use first index of. But you notice it doesn't give me that choice right now. Well, how come? How come it doesn't give me that first index of? Well, think about this. Well, this is something we've talked about before. When we compare two models, say we're comparing two activity models, how do we know they're the same? What tells us that they're the same model? Well, we have to supply that information. So what we're going to have to do is we're going to have to modify our activity model a little bit and tell it how it knows when two activities are equal to each other. This might sound familiar, and it is because we've done this before. If we look at our day model here, we implemented comparable. And specifically, we implemented this equals. And this is what we used to say this day equals this day. Now remember, we have a left-hand side and a right-hand side. It takes in two day models and it says, well, if the IDs are the same, then that means they're equal. So Swift doesn't know how two classes or two structs are equal. That's why we have to supply that information and tell it. So we're going to do something like this, but there's one difference. We don't really need the greater than in this case. So with the comparable or comparable, however you want to pronounce that, the comparable protocol here, you implement the greater than and then the equals. But there's another one, like if I hold down Command and I right click and go into here, we really just want this equatable right here. So if I hold down Command and go into equatable, which one do we go into? Let's try this Swift miscellaneous one. No, not that. I don't think so. So let's try the second one. Yeah, here we go. So this is the one that you're familiar with that I just showed you, where it compares two of them. So this is what we're going to implement right here, just the equatable part. Okay, so let's go into our activity model. And I think I'll do it with an extension. Okay, there we go. Okay, and let's take a look at that function again, just so we get it right here. And we'll just copy this part right here. I'm going to hold down Control Command Arrow to go back. And we'll just paste that in there and supply some code. And I'm going to say they are equal when, I need to change this. So this is an activity model. And then this will be an activity model. There we go. Okay, so they're equal when the left-hand side, and we'll look at the ID, because the ID is unique. This ID, it uses a UUID. So the ID is unique, so I'm going to use that. And when they are equal, when the left-hand side is equal to the right-hand side's ID, then that says that these two models are equal. Okay, so that should work. Let's go back to our error here. And now when we say first, let's see what we have here. Okay, now it's giving us the first index of. So this option wouldn't come up until we implemented equatable. And Swift is smart that way. So it knows that, well, it can't use first index of because it can't compare these two activity models. But now that it can, it's going to give us this option. Okay, and we pass in activity model. So that's going to be this parameter right here. All right, so if it does find something, and it should, because we're deleting it, so it has to exist. It's going to put the index right here. And now that we have the index, we can just use the remove function. And we want to use this one right here. Remove at this index. All right, and that should do it. Oh, because we use let here, we're mutating it. Okay, so we can make it a var, but you know what? Let's just access it right from here. There we go. And that should work. So let's build that, make sure everything's fine. All right, looks good. Okay, step 2, we're going to create the table trailing swipe action. So let's do that. Okay, so our next step is to create a trailing swipe action to delete an activity. Now we've created a trailing swipe action to delete our trips. So let's go into our trips view controller, and maybe we can use that as a starting point. Oh, let me just stop this for now. Okay, trips view controller. And then let's find the trailing swipe action here, which is right here. All right. And if you remember, we also created an alert, asking the user, are you sure you want to delete this trip? Delete or cancel. And then when they click delete, we delete it. So we're going to implement that same pattern again. So let's copy this. And let's go to our activities view controller. Okay. And here's the extension where it has all of our table functions. So let's just add it right down here. All right, great. So let's go through here, and we're obviously going to have to make some changes here. Like we're not deleting a trip. What we want to do is we want to use that index path to get our activity model. So let's change this variable here. This is going to be our activity, or we could say activity model, because we'll actually be using the model. Then we'll access our trips. And, this is the global variable data. But what I want to do is I want to use the local variable that we have here. So up here, if you look, we actually have a trip model right here. So that's what I'm going to use. All right, so we have our trip model. And then from there, we have our day model. So what day are we on? Well, that's the index path section. So let's access index path section right there. And then once we have the right day, we can access the right activity model. And the activity we're on is the index paths row, because that's the row that we're swiping on. There we go. All right, that'll give us the correct activity model. And then from there, we're going to create our contextual action. And this is the action that shows up when you actually swipe. So let's just double check it here. It's destructive. That means it's going to be red by default. And we have a title, delete. That'll work for us. Okay, so this is the action performed, this code right here. So this code will get run every time we call the delete. And we're going to create an alert. It's going to say delete trip. Well, we don't want to say delete trip. We want to say delete activity. Are you sure you want to delete this activity? And of course, we don't have a trip, so we have the activity model. So let's copy that. And it does have a title property, so we could probably just leave that the same. Preferred style is alert. Yeah, we want an alert to show up, as opposed to an action sheet. And I think this can stay the same. Action performed, false. Now remember this action performed function right here. What this does is if I click cancel, it'll move the row back into its original position. Because right now, when I swipe it, it'll expose the delete, and I tap that delete button, the red delete button. And then if I don't call action performed, it'll just stay open. But if I call action performed, it'll close it. So we definitely want to call action performed. And if we do delete, then this is where we want to perform the delete. Well, this is the wrong function, right? Because it's deleting a trip. We want to call our new function. So let me just delete this here. We'll access our activity functions right here. And we should see our delete activity. It's right there. Yep. Okay, so what trip are we on? That's the first parameter here that we have to define, is we need to get our trip index. Well, luckily, in this view controller, we created a function that gets the trip index. Let's see if we can find that here. Let me just search for it here. Get trip index. Yeah, it's right here. Get trip index. So this is what we're going to use. We'll just get the trip index by calling this function. Okay, for day. Now this is the day parameter. So how do we get that? Well, we can just get that from the index path. That's how we got the day up here. We just use the index path.section. So we could just replace that with the section. And then which activity model are we using? Well, we got that up here, activity model. So we're just passing that in right here. Okay, it's giving us an error. Let's take a look at that. Oh, you know what it might be? It might be because I need a self in here because we're inside of a closure. All right, there we go. Oh, and there's something else. Let's take a look. Oh, get trip index. Looks like it returns an optional int. You know, let's take a look at that. Let's go back to get trip index here. And you know what I think I'll do is instead of returning an optional, I think I'll just say it does exist because the screen won't be showing activities unless you had tapped on a trip. So the trip does exist. So I think I'm just going to say, hey, a trip always exists. And so we're always going to get a trip index back. All right, let's go back to our code. That fixed that. Okay, so we'll delete the row in the table. That's fine using this index path. That's the one we're swiping. And we'll use an automatic animation for that. And then action performed will be true. Okay, and this just presents the alert asking them, do you want to delete or not? Okay, delete image. Looks like we had our own. And it has this little error here. If you double click this, you know, when you see this icon symbol, if you double click it, it should fill in with the correct icon that we're using. Okay, and then we'll just return the swipe action, which has all this code that we just added to it. So let's run it now and just test it, see how it works. All right, and we'll just delete this activity. Yes, I wanted to delete. All right, good. So it looks like there's some kind of problem. I tried to delete it, but as you might guess, we'll probably get this error where it says the data, the backing data for the table view doesn't match the data after we tried to delete the row. Yeah, here we go. Invalid update, invalid number of rows in section 0. So this error, if you see this error, this can be kind of confusing when you see it at first. And you'll get this type of error for different actions, whether you're inserting, deleting, or changing the position of rows. You can get this error because basically what it's saying is what you see on the table view isn't matching the backing data. Usually the correct order to handle this is you need to handle the backend data first, update that backend data, and then you do your delete or your removals or your insertions into your table view second. So we didn't do that. We didn't delete the data from our backing source yet. So we're going to get this error. Our next step is to remove the activity from the local data variable so we don't have to reload the whole table. And maybe, after looking at these steps here, maybe I should have had a step number 5, which was to delete the row from the table view. So I've already added that deleting the row from the table view, but maybe I should have done step number 4 first. So we wouldn't have gotten that error. All right, so let's go in there and handle it. Okay, so here's where we delete rows. So remember that rule. What we have to do first is we have to handle the backing data first. Then we can perform these table view functions, which might be delete rows, insert rows. We want to access our trip model. And remember, the trip model is right here. This is what we're going to access. And actually, I'm just going to copy this because we want to access the activity models, and we're going to remove the activity using the index, using this index path.row. So let's copy that. We'll stick that in here. And actually, I'm going to need self to access it because we are inside of a closure. Okay, and from here, we want to do a remove at. And how do we know what index is at? Well, it's at the index path.row, the one we just swiped. All right, that should handle it. Let's run it again and test it. Actually, before we test that, let me just test cancel. Okay, good. So when I hit cancel, it calls this action performed by passing in false. And that is what makes it slide back like that. So if we delete now, there we go, deletes just fine. Okay, so everything is working fine. But you may have noticed back here, let's take a look. Something happened. And you could leave this error like this. It's basically a constraint conflict error. And if we take a look, you see it goes all the way up and down the table view here. So what is happening? What does this mean? It says at least one of the constraints in the following list is one you don't want. So what's happening is there's basically conflicting constraints, or it has a bunch of constraints and it's trying to enforce them. It's trying to make them all happen, but for some reason it can't happen. So let's investigate this and break it down and see if we can prevent this error from happening. Okay, unable to simultaneously satisfy constraints. Here's what's happening. There's some kind of conflict between constraints, and the error lists all of these constraints and says you probably don't want one of these and you need to fix it. So usually what you want to do is you want to delete a conflicting constraint. For example, sometimes you have two constraints on the UI element, and it's trying to apply two constraints at the same time, but it can't. Now, those are obvious to fix. For example, there might be two height constraints on there, and it's trying to set 1 to 50, and it's trying to set 1 to 100. So you got to figure out, well, which height constraint do you want? Do you want the 50 or the 100? And then you delete one of them. Then this error goes away. Like I said, those are the easy ones to fix. Not this one, though. Take a look. None of these constraints that are listed here are conflicting with each other, except this one. In that list of constraints, it shows us a UI view encapsulated layout height. And it's trying to set this height to 1.19. And what's tricky about this is we're not even setting this constraint. This isn't something that we're doing. It's something that's happening automatically from iOS, and we have no control over it. So why is this happening and how do we fix it? Well, we observed that we only get this error when we removed a cell, right? And from my research, some people believe it's the animation that's trying to adjust the size of the cell, and that's what's causing the conflict in the height. So in reality, we could leave this alone, and it'll never cause us any problems. It's just the animation that's making it smaller and kind of swiping it out of the way. But if you want to fix this, stick around and I'll show you how. So first, let's try to understand this problem a little bit more. Okay, so let's take a look at that animation again. And again, the animation I'm talking about is this one right here, this option. We set it to automatic. So when we run it, we're just going to observe the animation again. We'll go to Bali, and we'll delete it, and then look at the row. So notice how it squeezed up, and then that's how we got our error here. So my belief is, and let's go to the first one, just so we can take a look. It's this one right here. So my belief, and well, it's actually the belief of other developers from my research, is that this encapsulated layout height here, setting it to 1.19, that's not very high, right? So I think that's when it is deleting it and it's just making it more narrow until it eventually goes away. And then it conflicts with the other constraints that we already have in place. So the question is, how do we fix this? If we don't control that constraint, what can we do? The key is with constraint priority. Now, by default, all these constraints are required. We tell iOS's auto layout engine that they are required with the constraint's priority property. The default value is 1000, which says it's required at 1000. So auto layout is trying to force all of these constraints, and that encapsulated height constraint is causing a conflict. So from what I've researched, it seems like the best way to handle this conflict is not to take out one of our constraints, but instead leave all of our constraints in there, but just change the priority of one of them to less than 1000. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to go in and we're going to change the priority of one of these constraints so it's not required, which basically means any value under 1000. Okay, so I think we know enough about this problem and the solution to implement it in our project. So let's head back into our project and get it fixed up. All right, let's just stop the project here and we'll go into our storyboard. All right, let's take a look at our cell. Let's actually magnify this here a little bit. Okay, so here we have our constraints. We have the top constraint, the height, and then we have the lower constraint on the bottom there. And let's just change the priority. I'll change the priority of the bottom one. And I'll just use one of these values here. I'll just say it's a low priority. And notice when I change it to a lower priority, other than 1,000, it changes it to a dotted line. So that gives us a visual indication that it's not required. And again, what you can do too is you can just change it to 999 and it does the same thing because only 1,000 makes it required. Anything other than 1,000, it says it's not required. But I'm just going to use one of these preset values here, 250. Okay, let's try it now. And remember, what we're looking for is two things. First, we want to make sure that everything looks fine, everything looks the same with our constraints. And then when we delete one, we want to make sure we don't get that error again. All right, we'll go to Bali, and we'll just delete the same one. Now, you may notice, I'm just going to cancel this here. You may notice everything still looks the same, so that's fine. Everything's looking good. And, oh yeah, let's go here, and let's just maximize this here so we can, it's more obvious when a problem does occur, if a problem occurs, that is. Okay, so let's delete. We'll say yes. And look at that. We can delete, and there's no more conflicts. Yeah, everything looks good. All right, great. We fixed our conflicting constraint problem by going in and making one of our constraints not required. All right, guys, that's it for this video. If you followed along, good job on deleting activities from the itinerary and handling that conflicting constraint problem that we had. If you enjoyed this video, give it a thumbs up. Consider sharing it on social media. And make sure you're subscribed because we do have a few more videos to go before we finish this series. And I know you don't want to miss them. If you want to help out this channel, you can provide a translation for just the title and the description. Don't worry about subtitles because that is way too much work. All right, thanks guys, and keep climbing that big mountain to be a great developer.